far? Made some spring honey? Yeah. How about last year? Was that a good year for you? Last year was about as good a year for everybody that I can remember. Not everybody, there's always somebody gets left out. Last year was pretty unusually good. So I hope that trend continues. I thought we'd talk about wintering because that's about the next thing on the agenda for beekeepers. And hopefully you'll get a little fall flow before you have to worry about winter. But successful wintering starts in July and August, really. And September's not too late. And that's what we're going to talk about. By the way, this photograph, we don't get this very often here in Eastern Carolina, but that photo was taken right here in Big County, North Carolina in March 1980. So we had a right good little unusual snowfall, but we don't have that very often. You know, our honeybees are adapted to handle cold weather. You know, they're called European honeybees for a reason because they're not native to North America. They came over with early settlers, and they came from Northern Europe, and later on Central and Southern Europe. But if you draw latitude lines across from where the bees were native, it's pretty much right here in Central North, you know, right where we're at, more or less. And they are, even in Europe, you know, they live in the mountains at altitude. The black races, the Caucasians, they get their name from the Caucasus Mountains. And the Carnolians, they're cold weather bees. And of course, the Italians come from Italy or Southern Europe and the Mediterranean. But they got, you take bumblebees, for example, they're the native pollinators here in North America. And they have relatively small nests, maybe 300 bumblebees is a big bumblebee nest. And they make a little honey, not enough so you can have any. You know, they just make it in what's called a honey pot. It's just a big fat cell. That cells are more papery than waxy. And when cold weather comes, they don't cluster. The colony dies off except for the queen or queens, and the queens go out into the woods somewhere and find a warm spot in a leaf litter or somewhere, and they hibernate, go semi-dormant for the winter, and then when spring comes, they come back to life, and they solely establish another colony by themselves, the queen does, and then she lays workers, and they hatch, and then eventually she can spend more time laying eggs, but about 300 individuals is about as big as it gets. And so that's how they deal with cold weather. But European honeybees, of course, they stay active all winter. And one way they stay active all winter is they store surplus honey. And of course, that's what we take advantage of. That's why we go to sell honey. Because their natural behavior is to get out there and get on with the program. And ever how much nectar is available, they're going to put it up if they got room for it. And because they're getting ready for whatever winter is coming. And if you make it easy on them, then they make all the honey they can, and that's more than they need for winter. You take that off and sell it, and you don't even have to feed bees if that's the way you do it. And then how do they stay warm? Well, they cluster. The cluster generates heat in wintertime, and that's what keeps the colony alive. And of course, they rear winter bees. There's some controversy whether we raise winter bees in this latitude or not. We definitely have to have long-lived bees, no matter what you call them, because they got to live from December-ish till spring-ish, wherever that is, if it's March or whatever. They got to live through the winter, else they won't do you any good. Let me see here. This thing is touching.
Try using the arrows.
It's a little less touchy. We beekeepers can support the bees' natural behavior just by doing timely manipulations and inspecting them. And in chronological order, you need to do some disease control in July and August or September. Fall inspection is a good idea, October, November. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. winter feed if necessary. You know, you want them heavy enough to get through the winter. And ideally, you don't want to feed them all winter long. That's not ideal. I mean, it's better than them starving to death, but don't triple feed on them all winter. And then when spring, early spring comes, you need to check them again. Check them for, you know, feed and whatnot. And broil control is just part of beekeeping. I mean, there's natural control, there's soft chemical control, there's hard chemical control, whatever you want to call it. You got a lot of options these days. There's even a new product called Varroa socks. Roxanne, sounds like a 70s rock song. Roxanne. Anyway, I don't have much experience with it. I've talked to a couple of beekeepers that have used it, and they haven't used it long enough to know how well it works. But it seems to be easy to use. Has anybody here tried it yet? Roxanne.
It's the long acting.
Oxalic acid. I think it's oxalic glycerin combo that dispenses slowly over time. It's a good idea if it works, and I haven't heard anything bad about it yet. If you live in a part of the country where you have winter bees, they put together a little bit different. They got more fat on their bodies. They got a higher level of vitellogenin. They're programmed to live longer, 4 to 6 months instead of 6 or 7 weeks. And these bees are produced in the fall of the year before cold weather gets here. And it takes a lot of nutrition, takes a lot of pollen to make a long-lived bee, because these, if you look at them under a microscope, they got more fat on their bodies, and they got more protein stored in their bodies. They're kind of like using their body as a storage vehicle. And that way, when spring comes, if there's a little bit of shortage of pollen in early spring, they can use some of the stored protein and fat on their bodies to get the colony kick-started in the early spring. Vitellogenin is also in the workers and the queens, for that matter. But it's an odd, I'm not an expert on vitellogenin, but it acts both as a hormone and as it's a very complicated, look it up, read it. You can spend an hour reading about vitellogenin, but it's a fun compound. Look at here, let me just fly. You in a hurry? I can get through this thing. All right. Of course, the reason I put winter feed in October, November is, and we'll talk about this more in a minute, it's better for the bees if they're light, and maybe you pull all that expensive honey off and you want to replace it with cheaper sugar or syrup. You need, for the bees' sake, do most of it before it gets really cold, because they need to take the syrup and work it up just like they would nectar, and thicken it and store it in the comb. And they have a harder time doing that when cold weather comes, you know, when they're clustered or where they're lightly clustered or whatnot. And also feeding is more difficult in cold weather. Broil control is important because doing it early is the key here. And whether you're talking about winter bees or just long-lived bees, longevity is the key. And how do you get bees that are long-lived? Well, they need to be healthy. Sick bees don't live so long. So if you got sick bees, you're going to have a tough time in winter. There's a correlation, a direct correlation between varroa control and virus control. There is no medicine for viruses. There's hardly any medicine for viruses in humans, and there's zero medicine for viruses in honeybees. You just depend on their natural immune system. And for their immune system work, they need good nutrition. But there's a direct correlation between varroa levels, the amount of varroa in your colony, and what the titer is for the viruses in your colony. There's 22, 23 identified viruses. There's probably many more that haven't been identified yet. And none of them cause longevity. There is no beneficial virus that I'm aware of And so if they do anything, they're gonna shorten bees' lifespans. And of course, both types of deformed wing virus, one type doesn't have deformed wings, ironically, and the other type you can easily see. It's the only virus where you can easily see what you got. Deformed wings, that's easy. Type, I forget what it's type A or B, but the other type, they don't even have deformed wings, but it's a very serious infection because it affects multi-body systems and it shortens their lifespan, no question about it. Let me ask you a question. If you go for a walk in the woods and you get some ticks, a tick, multiple ticks, and maybe you come home at night and they've already seized somewhere, and you catch them when you get ready to go to bed, and you remove them, the little jaws stuck in there, get your tweezers, and it might leave a little red spot and it itches, but that's really about the end of it. I mean, no big deal, right? But if these ticks are carrying disease, like, oh, I don't know, Rocky Mountain spotted tick fever, Lyme disease, tuberculosis, babesia, whatever. Kirby, correct my pronunciation if you want to.
You're doing good.
And the list goes on. I won't try to name them all, but we got them here in North Carolina. So far, everything I named, we got.
Yep.
Lyme disease used to be up north, but it's here and it's here to stay. Don't forget gamma globulin disease, red meat, causes red meat allergy. You can't eat burgers for a while. So we don't want that. So really what the serious part is not the tick bite, it's the disease that the vector or carry. Same thing with varroa mites. The varroa mites parasitize in the brood and suck in the blood or the hemolymph or the fat bodies. They do both, by the way. It's not just one or the other. They do blood and fat. Anyway, let's don't get in that controversy. They do both, trust me. But that's bad enough, but it's the diseases that vector is the real problem. And so they're a reservoir for all of these viruses. And that's why it's important to control them, because of the damage that the viruses can do. And deformed wing virus is one of the more serious ones. This is a little quote here. It just makes the point that in this study, they found that low varroa destructor, that's varroa, levels during the development of winter bees resulted in an increase in lifespan. So lower varroa, longer lifespan. Conversely, higher varroa, lower lifespan. And so that's why we're talking about treatment or doing something to interrupt the varroa. I know some people don't like to treat, but you got to do some natural, which or something. Bees aren't ready. Most bees are not ready to keep the levels low by themselves without any assistance from humans. The major cause of winter mortality that I see in Eastern Carolina is what I call dwindling. And how do you define dwindling? Well, I can describe it for you. You go into the winter and you got a nice sized cluster. What would you call a nice cluster? Say it's early winter, a late fall, it's 45 degrees outside, you take the lid off, they got a cluster, it's a light cluster. What would you like to see inside your colony? Full-size colony?
Probably at least over 4 frames.
Yeah, I would describe it as, that would be a bare minimum in my book. I would like to see a basketball-sized cluster, you know, a full-size basketball and 45 degrees. And cluster size is pretty important. And when you got a dwindling problem, ironically, this affects bees that were the strongest the previous fall. They might have been some of your highest producers. And you get, there might be a huge cluster early in the fall or late in the fall. But then along about December or early January, this, what was a huge cluster has shrunk down to the size of a couple of softballs. And it can be very dramatic in a matter of a couple of months. They can just shrink like crazy. And I get calls every winter just about that my bees have absconded because the bees have shrunk, dwindled, and they're not dead on the bottom board, and they're not many more than usual dead out front. What happened to them? They absconded. Well, they don't abscond in the wintertime I never say never about honeybees, because like somebody said earlier, they don't read the book, but it's very unusual for them to try to abscond in the wintertime, because, I mean, they ain't stupid, they know that, yeah, wintertime's not the time to be leaving, you know, you might as well die in place, because you're gonna leave, and you're guaranteed to die. But, in warm weather, you know, if they get overrun by hive beetles, they'll abscond. I've seen them abscond when they got overrun by European foulbrood or American foulbrood, either one. They'll get all hemmed up and they say, well, there ain't no future for us here, so we're gonna take off. You know, and we might stand a chance. And it's a good behavior, because they might stand a chance if they leave all that disease behind and start over again. And so the cluster gets smaller and smaller as the winter time goes on, and then in December, January, you get down to one softball size. And when you get that small, they lose the ability to regulate the temperature, because the cluster is what creates heat, and it's also what traps heat. It's what allows the bees not to get too cold. You know, the queen, if she gets cold for too long, you know, like in the 40-degree temperatures, it's going to mess up her ability to lay eggs. And even the workers will chill after an extended period of time in the 40-degree range, and they might, you know, fall off of the what little cluster there is and die. Sometimes they die with dwindle or die with plenty of honey on them, so they're not starving. You just see them shrinking, and they may have 50 pounds of honey on them, but it doesn't have anything to do with honey or starving. Although they can starve when they get to honey. Usually you don't see very many dead bees on the bottom board. You might see a few, but not a lot. So what is the natural behavior of honeybees when they get sick, any time of the year? To leave the colony. The altruistic behavior. It's just a natural behavior. If they think they're sick, or if their little brains tell them they're sick, they crawl outside to die. And that's just to spare their nest mates from whatever problem they've got. So they die out in the grass somewhere. So that's just their natural instinct. And some people call it colony collapse. Well, you know, colony collapse is that unfortunate term they gave to the syndrome that started at almond groves in 2015, something like that. And it lasted a couple of years and scared everybody to death. I haven't seen colony collapse disorder in North Carolina, and they haven't seen it in almond groves in quite a long time. We don't have time. We could do a whole presentation on how that unfolded and then eventually went away. But it had to do with some of the fungicides they were putting on almond trees that they thought were safe for bees. It turns out it wasn't so safe. It compromised their immune system. And then when you got along about that time, they discovered that we thought we had Nosema disease, which is we discovered that what we thought was our good old-fashioned Nosema was really a novel Nosema called Nosema ceranae, which was jumped from one species, Apis ceranae, to Apis mellifera. And so that was discovered while they're trying to figure out what's causing these bees to die. So you got this exotic, heretofore undescribed, unnoticed Nosema disease affecting the bee's gut. You got fungicides affecting their immune system, and this made for some very unusual symptoms, which caused the colony to collapse. Literally, they dwindle to nothing, and sometimes there'd be a queen and a few workers left with several frames of brood, and they were just acting very strange, and it scared everybody. And fortunately, it generated a lot of money to start studying bees, and that's why we know we got Apis ceranae and not the good old-fashioned kind. So here's an example of bees that just dwindle down to nothing. These are dead on this picture. They're hanging onto the comb, and they died in situ. And you see, you got honey right up there at the corner, so they didn't starve, but they just got so small. I mean, there's nothing there to generate heat. And of course, they can't regulate the temperature like that. So you got to do brood control early. You also need to check for, you do a fall check, and you need to catch, disease, this is American foul brood here in this image. And this is something you keep your eyes open for all year round, of course. But if you find a cell of AFB, you want to find it early so that you limit the problem to one colony instead of letting it spread to the whole apiary. Because the reason the American foul brood is so serious is it's a spore-forming bacteria that causes it, and the spores in spore form can live 60, 70 years and still be viable. So it's just a continuous problem. If you ever get it in your outfit, spread around and you try to suppress it with antibiotics, which beekeepers used to do, you can suppress it so you don't see the vegetative stage very often. Usually, even especially the big beekeepers, they'll crop up once in a while. But as soon as you don't treat for with antibiotics regularly, like 2 or 3 times a year, then everything starts breaking down in foul brood. Terrible. And you get on that merry-go-round, and of course now that would be pretty much, it would be improper use of antibiotics. It's just not only is it not recommended, it's the wrong thing to do. So we used to have a fumigation chamber in Raleigh where we could take your disease equivalent. If I found a colony like this, we could destroy the bees, take the equivalent and sterilize it in the chamber, and the wax is intact, and bring it back to you, and the bees can clean out the detritus, and then you start over. You haven't lost the wooden goods, you haven't lost the wax necessarily. But we lost the permit to run the thing, and so now we got a chamber with no permit and no way to sterilize equipment. So if you see American foul brood nowadays, we're going to have to destroy the colony and burn the equipment. And we can probably save the empty super shells and possibly the bottom board, and that's it. And we do that by flaming it with a torch. But usually if you get a case of it, a lot of beekeepers just want to burn everything and just get it away. I don't want it. And I don't blame you, I don't want it either. But if you catch it early, this is the key. I'm happy to report that I haven't seen any American foul brood in my territory this year. And I saw very little last year. I think I saw 1 case. And if you go back a couple of years, I saw 40, 45 cases, something like that. If you go back, I don't know, another 5 or 10 years, I've seen as much as 100 cases in a year. But the trend is going toward less AFP, which is great. But it's always out there. I mean, if you ever get a case of it, you will not be able to figure out usually how you got it. Now, granted, if you had somebody, anyway, almost never can you figure out how you got it. And you're going to want to know, but there's no rhyme or reason to it. Chances are that you can find some American foul brood spores in many of your colonies at a very low level. And they got some natural resistance, and I guess I can't spend all my time talking about AFB, but it's important. For one thing, it takes somewhere between 6 and 12 spores to make a larva infested, and it has to be exposed in the first 3 days of life. If it gets exposed later than that, then the bacteria does not have time to kill the larvae before it gets in the prepupal stage, and the bee never gets sick, and there is no contamination. Well, there's probably some fecal contamination, but it doesn't necessarily cause the colony to break down.
Do you think that bees, the ones that don't die, come immune to it?
No. There are bees that are resistant to American foul brood, both by behavior and probably genetically, but it's real complicated. It's mostly behavioral. Resistant to American foul brood bees are super hygienic. They're good at uncapping disease brood of all types and removing it. You have to have both. There's 1 gene for uncapping and 1 gene for removal. And bees are really good at that. You have 1 cell breakdown, you probably don't even notice it. They clean it up immediately, dump it outside in the grass, and it may never cause the colony to break down, and you might not even be aware of it. And that's one way to control it. But the other way is to keep your eyes out for it. And we have more hygienic bees. I mean, we can talk about varroa. You see uncapped pupa in a varroa infection, and some of these bees that are being bred are good at uncapping and disturbing varroa reproduction. And some of this hygienic behavior carries over into reducing American foul brood incidents. And why the level is dropping, I don't know. I'm not complaining. I'm glad to see it. One theory is there's been a lot of bees died in the last 10 years from varroa and other management errors, and the wax moths eat the comb up, and so there's a lot of new fresh comb out there, which means there's not a lot of spore load in the comb because it's almost all new. But I don't know, it's all theory right now. So the main thing that you need, many reasons to catch it early, but what happens when you have a weed colony in the fall of the year that might have quite a bit of honey left on it? Robbing. The fall is prime time for robbing. Well, if you got a colony that even has a mild case of American foul brood, and it gets weak in the fall, and other bees in the apiary rob it, all of the honey on that colony has spores in it, American foul brood spores. And so the robber bees take the honey back, contaminate with spores to their colony. The nurse bees feed on that honey, and then they feed the larvae that contain the spores, and then they start breaking down. And that's how you can go from one colony to a dozen or the whole apiary breaking down. I've seen individual apiaries with 100 colonies that have American foul brood in every one of them, of splits. The beekeepers split like 40 colonies into 100 splits, and every one of them had American foul brood. And I came along to inspect them right after he split them, and nobody noticed that discolored brood was AFB. And that was kind of sad.
So is there any value in running that little test every now and then? Will it pick up that degree of, no, it's gotta be pretty bad.
It's gotta be pretty bad.
Okay.
It's detecting the proteins generated by the vegetative state. And if you don't have a good vegetative state, it's not gonna do anything.
Okay.
Now, you can swab it and get, it's complicated, you can swab it, the colony, and then centrifuge it and concentrate whatever you got in your swab in a diluent, and then concentrate the diluent, and then plate it, and then incubate it, which is hard to incubate AFB, by the way, because it takes a real special medium. But you can do that and get a feel for how many colony forming units you got in a colony. And they've done that experimentally, and that's why we know that you can find low levels of spores in a colony that's perfectly healthy. And I think Australia does swabbing in their apiary inspection service because they want to catch it before it breaks out. And just be cautious when you're feeding bees. If you feed honey, know where the honey comes from, because if somebody gives you honey, it may have spores in the honey, and of course you can eat all the American foul brood spores you want to, because it only affects honeybee. Honeybee larvae, to be precise, because if you're an adult bee, American foul brood don't hurt you. It's just the pre-pupal, the larval stage, and it dies in the pre-pupal stage. But anyways, yeah, I could talk all night about American foul brood, but you want to avoid it, and you want to keep your eyes open. I've never met a good beekeeper that wasn't an observant beekeeper. You got to practice observation if you're not naturally observant. And just the best way to tell if you got something abnormal going on is if you're a beginner, just become super familiar with what healthy looks like. What does a healthy larvae look like? Healthy eggs, healthy laying pattern, healthy adults, healthy brood. And once you come focused in on what healthy is, then when something is abnormal, you'll go, oh, something's wrong here, this don't look right. And you don't have to identify it. That's what we're for. We've got apiary inspectors across the state. Give us a call, we'll identify. I'd say 9 times out of 10, I get calls, and I think I got AFB, and it's usually not, because, anyway, there's a lot of things that can cause the brood to die and be discolored. American foul brood ropes out and is viscous, but it comes in all stages, and when it dries up, it's called scale, and it won't rope out because it turns into a tarry mess, and you can't even remove it with a probe. So just call us, because you got this resource, and that's our gig. I think among us, we probably see more American foul brood, and hopefully we see more than any individual beekeeper, because if you see a lot, then there's something bad wrong. And the field it's easy to determine if you got A and B in the field because of the unique, it kills the pupa in the pre-pupal stage only. And, there is no just wide disparate age of the larvae. It's one very specific age. It has a very specific look. And so it's usually pretty easy to determine in the field that you got American pollen. So how much food do you need to get in the winter? Just to give you an idea, here in eastern North Carolina, basically, 6 5/8 super holds about, 30, 40 pounds of honey. And, you're gonna need, a full shallow super of honey. And, you're gonna need a little extra. So a shallow full and maybe some of the deeps with honey on the sides. And that's gonna keep a full-size colony through the winter, in most winters in North Carolina. Now, if you got a smaller colony, they might eat less. If you got a bigger colony, obviously you're gonna keep an eye on them. If we have a warm winter, what's gonna happen?
Eat more.
They eat more in the warm. They eat less in cold, which is good. Cold weather, just, if you got a normal size cluster, cold weather does not kill bees. You remember a few years back, we had winter temperatures there for a week or so, and it was playing with 0, which is pretty unusual around here. Healthy bees that had a decent cluster came through that winter looking good. They ate less honey, and they looked better when spring finally got here. So, in some ways, a nice cold snap in the wintertime makes for a good winter for the bees and a good spring, provided they're healthy and they got a functional cluster. So if they're lightweight in the fall, or if you take the honey off and you want to replace it with something, what to give them? Well, sugar syrup, honey. When I say honey is ideal, I don't mean feed them honey. I mean combs of honey that they've already produced left on the colony is, ideal for the bees. That's what they prefer. But the next best is sugar syrup, and for most beekeepers, it's just white granulated sugar from the grocery store, something that you would eat, and just mix it in the wintertime, a 2-to-1 ratio, kind of heavy. That way they don't have to deal with that extra water. In the spring, you won't get thinner syrup because you just want the stimulative effect as well as the feed. But in the wintertime, you don't care about the stimulation so much, you just want the feed. Fructose, like you were talking about here, it comes in 42, 55% and other ratios. Of course, you can make candy or fondant, and it all works. I mean, basically, you're getting food where the cluster can reach it, and that's what works. And it's your option of how you want to do it. Just avoid damaged sugar. I've seen people buy, like a warehouse burned down, and they buy a few 100 pounds of burnt sugar. Not a good idea. I mean, you get by with it sometimes, but don't do it. Don't feed molasses. Don't feed imitation maple syrup, which I've seen. It wasn't even real maple syrup, but bees don't want that stuff. They'll try to eat it if they're starving, but it ain't good. And don't feed natural sugar because it's natural, because natural sugar is just white granulated sugar that somebody mixed a little molasses in to make it turn light brown. Bees can't process molasses, they don't have, it has nothing for them. So sugar, white granulated sugar mixed with water is sucrose, just sucrose. And that's an analog for nectar because that's the sugar and nectar. It's sucrose and water and then a bunch of good stuff, the polyphenols and the vitamins, well, not many vitamins, but a lot of antioxidants that come from the plant and the stuff that gives it flavor. But basically this is the sugar without the flavor, and the bees can live quite well on that.
On the previous frame, the full shallows and the half deeps, does that have any bearing on how many boxes that you have in that hive?
I mean, you can have more. You can have more honey than it needs, if you don't do it that way. But you don't want the honey spread out for the winter time. You want it down where the cluster is, so Well, we'll come to it in a minute, but as the winter progresses, the cluster usually starts in the bottom, and then they slowly make their way up as the winter progresses, eating on their way up. And don't feed coke syrup. I had a case where somebody bought 55-gallon drums of used coke syrup or unexpired coke syrup, and they drank it, but it didn't do them real well. It gave them a little bit of the runs, and because they had everything in it, Mr. Pibb, Dr. Pepper, Mountain Dew, all mixed together, you know. Yeah. Anyway, don't do that. Crystallized honey is not good winter feed. I mean, cotton can do that, asters can crystallize really fast, and don't worry if you have a little bit of crystallized honey, but just don't have a whole super of it to get them through the winter. You'd be better off to pull it off and figure out a way to extract it and feed them syrup. And that doesn't happen often, but it could happen. And this is just showing you, there's 100 ways to feed bees, you know? We could do a whole hour on just feeding bees, of course. But I put this up here because this is just a simple, you can be as simple or as complicated as you want to make it. That's just a pickle jar, a glass jar with holes punched into it. And now he doesn't have any shells on there, but if you want to be fancy, you can put a deep shell around that and put the lid on it, and then it would be out of the weather and whatnot. But believe it or not, it ain't a bad system if you got a few hives, because in the fall of the year, if you're feeding like a bucket or something of that nature, 2 gallons or especially 5 gallons, we have cold nights and then it warms up and the sun shines on in the daytime and it causes atmospheric pumping. And the size of that bucket will dump a little bit of syrup on them every cycle of temperature. And that's not, if they're a big colony, they can handle it, but a small colony is kind of stressful in there. And try not to feed continuously. I see that sometimes. Beekeepers sometimes love the bees, especially if you're small hobbyist, and you can love them to death because you can feed them all winter long, and you can fill up that empty space that they need to have in the middle, and you can crowd them, and it can also lead to swarming in the early spring like February because they're crowded and they're overfed. So don't overfeed. It's just like your pet. You don't want to overfeed your dog, then you take him to the vet, and the vet goes, "What in the world are you doing here? You got a Chihuahua that weighs 25 pounds. You know, or your cat, you know, I thought all cats are supposed to look like, you know what I mean. Well, at least Kirby knows. I'm sure you've never had to talk to a pet owner about
Morbidly obese, we use it not infrequently.
Right. So now honeybees are not going to get fat, but they can get overfed and cause swarming. And another reason not to feed thin syrup in the wintertime is if unfortunately they don't have any honey and they don't have any thick syrup. I've seen a case where the bees had nothing but thin syrup to eat. And they don't have kidneys like we do, and they can't get rid of that extra moisture. And so they swelled up. They had edema so bad that worker bees couldn't crawl through any queen school. That doesn't happen often, but I'm just telling you, that's why you don't want to do that, because they can't process all that water. You already know this, pollen is a source for protein, fats, vitamins, and antioxidants, and minerals, and all that good stuff, and honey is the energies, carbohydrates, and it's all good stuff. Pollen is essential for raising healthy bees. You gotta have it for brood rearing, you gotta have it to get ready for winter, to get your winter bees in order. One way you can tell how the nutrition for your colony is going is just look and see how well fed your young larvae are. This is an example of young larvae that is generously fed. I mean, they could live and grow with less feed than that. But often when there's plenty of resources and nurse bees are healthy, they're going to feed them extra. And if you see the same photograph and there's just barely enough larval food in there to keep them alive, then they might be nutritionally stressed. They might be a little short of pollen, and the nurse bees might be a little bit less than healthy. Just a tip. Pollen supplement is very rare that you need it in eastern North Carolina. We're blessed. You look on YouTube, you read books, and you hear about all the pollen dearth. we have pollen coming in almost 12 months out of the year. And that's rare, not a lot of places have that. But we have pollen literally, I can't think of a month where we don't have some pollen coming. All winter long, if it's warm enough, they can get some pollen, dandelion, maples, and so forth. So I would suggest don't feed a pollen supplement unless there's a reason to do it. Because one thing that a pollen supplement is good for is feeding small hivebees. Because they really like that stuff and they can really go to town on it. And if the bees don't need it, you don't need hivebees. And rarely do I look in a colony in the wintertime here in North Carolina that's got a patty on them and move the patty, and there's always small hive beetle larvae underneath the patty, at least a few. And you don't want to see small hive beetle larvae any time of the year if you can help it. And if you must feed the pollen for supplement or stimulation, and you have a beetle problem, try feeding it in open air, dry, in the apiary, and let the bees fly out to the feeder and collect a lot of pollen. That'll avoid the small hive beetle problem. This is what I call a nice sized cluster. If that was my colony in the late fall, I would be very pleased. 6 to 8 frames would be ideal. And this cluster is big enough to regulate heat and their temperature. You know, the way it works, the cluster expands and contracts based on the temperature. It gets really cold down to 0, they get really tight. And then when it warms up, they get looser. And then finally, most bees here in Eastern Carolina start flying in the high 40s. 49 degrees, they're flying. And the black ones will fly. I've seen them fly about 40, you know, they don't care. They're tough. So the cluster heats itself. The bees don't try to heat the colony. You know, obviously some of the heat that escapes from the cluster is trapped by the colony. So you have a temperature gradient from the cluster out to the outside, and that's the way it's designed. And bees eat honey, they contract their wing muscles, this generates heat. The colder it gets, the more honey they eat, and the more they contract their muscles. 92 degrees Fahrenheit is what the center of the cluster is if they're trying to raise brood, and here in North Carolina they usually have a little bit of brood in the middle all winter. All right, that's an infrared picture of a cluster, and you see the temperature gradient for the cluster. The inside is 92 Fahrenheit, and the very outside edge is 55. And so these adult bees can be perfectly happy and healthy at 55. And what happens is, even if it's 0 outside, the outside bees rotate to the inside and get warm. The warm bees rotate to the outside, they take turns, and that way nobody gets chilled. So that's pretty cool. And you can see a cluster from outside the beehive with an infrared camera. I mean, if you had an infrared camera, you could go through your bee yard in wintertime and see where the cluster is and how big it is. And you see that cluster is in the second hive body, so obviously it's probably late in the winter because they started in the bottom and they worked their way up. And they're a little bit off to one side. So if I was a beekeeper, I'd want to poke in there and make sure they got honey within reach of the cluster. They probably do. It's probably all blocks. Just to be sure. Large clusters can move easier to reach food as they consume it in cold weather. They span a larger area. They can span the gap between 2 supers. You know, a small cluster, the gap can cause them to not get to the next super of honey. Yep, I just said. Small clusters can starve with plenty of honey on them because they get stuck in one spot and they can't move to get to the honey. And that's a shame when that happens. Yep, we talked about that. Large clusters got a better surface to volume ratio. You know, a cluster is usually relatively round. A sphere. It's a ball shape like a basketball. Okay. Sphere. What? Why can't I talk tonight?
Sphere.
Sphere. Okay, we're gonna call it a sphere. We'll see the heat escapes from the cluster on the periphery, of course. The outside perimeter is where the heat escapes. Well, the heat's generated from the volume or the inside part, and of course the warmest part is right in the center. And so the larger the cluster, the more efficient it is at warming the inside compared to the amount of surface area where the heat is lost from. And here I'm gonna scare you with, that's what we just said, heat's generated and it loses on the outside. And we already talked about that, and densely packed bees, and they rotate from outside to inside so they don't get chilled. Here's a little math for you. The formula for the surface of a sphere is 4 times pi times the radius squared, and the volume formula is 4/3 pi times the radius cubed, okay? You didn't know it's gonna be math tonight. So here's some example of the volume and the surface area of different size clusters. So basically, to give you an example, a 6-inch cluster has got a volume to surface ratio of 2:1. You double it and it's 4:1. You double it again and it's 8:1 ratio for the volume to the surface area. And you can go home and send me an email if I got my math wrong, but you get the principle, right? As the ball grows, you got more volume in comparison to the surface, and that makes it more efficient, obviously. And that's why you can win. European honeybees are kept outside successfully in upstate New York, and some of the provinces of Canada, and southern Alaska. And a long time ago, I used to have a customer that lived in southeast Alaska in Haines, and he bought queens, and he's had a successful little honey business, and he wintered outdoors, and he made a ton of honey in a very short period of time. But when the summer hit, it hit suddenly, and the days last, 22 hours, and the bees work practically 24 hours a day, which is pretty cool, and they have lots of forage also in a very short amount of time. And if I recall correctly, he said it took him about an average of 80 pounds of honey to get his bees through the winter, which, ain't bad. Ironically, a real cold winter where they're broodless for many weeks at a time or many months at a time, they eat a lot less honey than they do in the southern latitudes where they keep that brood going all winter. Brood consumes a lot of stores, and just keeping live bees and keeping them warm is a lot less energy dependent than keeping brood alive. You don't want the warm cluster, the heat, just like if I breathe on a mirror, or you do, and it's going to fog up because we got breathing out carbon dioxide and water. And bees do the same thing. They exhale carbon dioxide and water, and moisture can rise from the cluster, hit a cold spot, and condense. And in a bad case, it can drip back down on the cluster and cause molding on the top of the frames, and you don't want that. It doesn't happen super often, but if you see it, you need to fix it, And it only takes a little bit of ventilation, a little bit of a toothpick or a crack is usually all it takes to let a little bit of that warm, moist air escape. And of course, the lid probably has something to do with that. That's just showing. And listen, with the advent of the internet and YouTube, you can find 2,700 different ways to ventilate your hive. Just pick one, and that's all that's necessary. And some empty comb is good. It's like overfeeding problem. If you overfeed your bees, you're gonna force them to have every comb full of food, syrup. Syrup is cold. If you go outside in the wintertime and put your hand on a wooden table, let's say it's 32 degrees, and then you put over here, you put your hand on a metal table, and it's still 32 degrees. The metal table is going to feel really, really cold. The wooden table is going to feel a lot less cold, but they're both 32 degrees. What's the difference? The metal table transfers heat super fast, and the wood table transfers heat super slow. Beeswax is a great insulator. It doesn't transfer heat really fast, but syrup is a pretty good conductor, and so if they have to sit on cold honey and syrup, it's relatively uncomfortable for them. In a natural setting, they got brood and pollen and empty frames in the core of the cluster, and then the periphery of the cluster is where the honey sits. That's just ideal, but you can always approach the ideal is what I'm getting at. And I'm probably talking about overfeeding your bees mostly. Interest reducers help prevent robbing, and you don't want the mice to get in there and chew holes in your comb and just make a mess. Nobody wants mice in their house, including the bees. You do not have to open the bee colony in weather like this, or even if it's just cold. But it's probably a good idea in February, if it's cold and you don't want to disturb the bees, is just to hoist the colony and see what it feels like. And if it feels like a stack of empty boxes, then you need to get busy and open it up. I don't care how cold it is. And you might need an emergency feed. And if you'll do this in the summertime, you just lift some hives and you get a feel for what they feel like, and you know how much honey they're in, and then you can just compare that. And the light ones you can open up, and I don't care how cold it is, I'll open a beehive if they're hungry. And even if they're in the 30s, as long as you open them up, or the 20s for that matter, if it's important, just hold the frames over the cluster so that bees that fall off fall back on the cluster and they can get back up there. Because if you hold them away and they get on the ground, then they're going to chill out and die. That's all. Just be careful. And most bees starve in March, and warm winters cause more starvation than cold. This is starvation. All these bees are dead. They ate up their honey, and you can see their little heads are stuck in the cell with a little tail stuck out. And basically, it looks like they just went in and licked the last little bit of syrup or honey out, and then that's it. They died. Honeybees don't have a lot of storage for energy, and so when their food runs out, they have a little bit of fat, but not much. But unlike us, I mean, some of us have got enough fat to walk the Appalachian Trail without eating a snack, But bees don't do that. So when they run out of food, it's just like a diabetic running out of, sugar. They get hypoglycemic and die. And that's a sad sight. There's two kinds of starvation. The kind where you run out of food and they just go around to every cell in the colony and consume it, and it's just all empty. And then it's the kind where they run out of food, but the colony's still got plenty of food on it, and it's just out of reach like that. Those bees on the left are dead. They starved to death. And there's honey right over there to the right. But they had like a 50-cent piece of brood underneath them, and they will not leave that brood. They'll starve rather than go over there 6 inches and get some honey, because they're trying to keep the brood warm. They're tough that way. And this is another example of bees that are about to starve. Well, you see the dead queen there? She starved too, of course. You see her in the top half. Where's my pointer? I want to show you a dead queen tonight.
She's got 11 o'clock.
Poor thing. That's sad. I have to say, I've seen that in my bees and many, many other people's bees. You don't want that to happen if you can help it. But look how small they are. It's not surprising that they're in bad shape, because something happened before this. But if you have a small cluster, preferably they're bigger than that, before they starve, and if they got honey out of place, just try to move the honey as close to the cluster as you can. If you can't move the honey close to the cluster, then put some candy fondant right on top of them so they don't have anywhere to go. No matter how cold it gets, they're in contact with food. Here's an example of how you can feed sugar or fondant in a very simple way. This is a 5-frame nuke that a beekeeper, I took this picture. So this is sort of local-ish. This is a 5-frame nuke the beekeeper was trying to winter. They didn't have enough feed in the 5-frame portion. He took a newspaper and put on top of the 5-frame nuke. He took a 5-pound bag of sugar and poured it on top of the newspaper. And put the empty 5-frame shell on top of it. That's what you see the sides are over here. This is the empty shell. And of course, he had a top on it before I took the top off. And they had honey in the bottom, but not enough to get through the winter. And so they ate a little honey. They come up and they turn this. This was granulated sugar, and the moisture from the colony and the moisture from the air made it cake up. So it's kind of like a self-made. You didn't have to cook it. You didn't have to stir it. All you had to do is let nature take its course. And then they started out here eating, and they've eaten the sugar this far, and of course they've chewed the paper off, and you see a few remnants of the newspaper. And so it's self-cleaning, and if they don't need it all, when spring comes, the beekeeper can take what's left and dump it in a 5-gallon bucket and save it and feed it next year. So it's also controlled waste, because as you know, if you have syrup that gets old, it eventually mold and you'll have to throw it away. But granulated sugar is not gonna do that. If you lose a hive in winter, try to disturb the dead out, because there's a lot of clues in the dead out. If you leave it in situ, don't mess it up. And call the inspector. And again, we're out here, it's our job. And sometimes we can determine or get a clue as what happened to your colony. But if you clean it all up and put it in the barn, then that takes away all the clues. You know, for example, you can tell whether it got robbed out or not. You can tell whether they starved or not. You can tell whether they had a high broiler count or not, and some other things, if you leave it in place. A few years ago, I wouldn't put this slide in here, but I have a surprisingly number of beekeepers in eastern North Carolina that try to pack their bees. I don't recommend that. And why, you might ask?
Moisture?
What?
Moisture?
Moisture. In the far north, they do pack bees sometimes, you know, like upstate New York and Canada and whatnot. But what kind of winter precipitation do you have in the north? It's frozen, right? It's all frozen. And what's the humidity in upstate New York in the wintertime?
Cold.
The humidity is less than 50%. It's probably in the 20s most of the time. So there is no moisture. It's not a moisture problem. But in North Carolina, we have liquid moisture all winter long practically. Freezing rain.
Like today.
Yeah.
You know, we could have the day in February and it wouldn't be frozen. So what happens is this packing gets wet and it can trap moisture, it can mold, it can mildew, and it can cause more stress than it helps. So just get a windbreak. Well, actually, we don't need a windbreak around here. Just if you got a tight beehive, that's all the windbreak you need. In the mountains, sometimes beekeeper might try to get in a leeward side of some obstacle like a barn or a grove of trees or shrubs. But here, you really don't have to worry about it usually. Just got a tight colony. You know, even if you got holes in your beehive, just chink them with something and they'll be all right. But in the summertime, those holes are helpful. It gives them some ventilation. And that's what we just talked about. Sun shining down on a black packing can overheat the colony in the wintertime. It can force them, it can cause them to brood up too fast, and then when a cold snap comes, the brood gets chilled. And it's stressful, so don't do it. That's a wrap job right here from Eastern Carolina. And I never put pictures from beekeepers in my area and put names with them. And frankly, I don't remember their name. I probably could if I sit around and think about it, but this was a few years back, and they were trying to nurse this 5-frame nuke through the winter, and they knew it was small, and they knew it was almost hopeless, but they really wanted to save this. They had an affection for this little nuke. So this is a solid foam insulation taped around the outside of the 5-frame box. And, well, obviously, you see what that is. And there's enough bricks on there to make it hurricane-proof. And
strap. A lot of straps.
Plenty of straps. I think one of the straps had been taken off before I took a picture. It took me longer to get into the colony than it did to look at the colony. But I give them credit for ingenuity. And they took care of the moisture problem because, I mean, they got an eave all the way around about, whatever, 1.5 feet. But that colony survived, by the way. Hey, usually you don't need to do it. So let's review. You want strong, healthy colonies. You want to control broil. You want as large a cluster as practical. You want to control disease before it gets winter time. You evaluate your colony weight and feed early in the season before it gets cold if possible. Obviously, you always want to feed no matter how cold it is if they're starving. And give them the syrup that they need early. keep the food in reach of the cluster. You know, if it gets out of whack in the winter time, move them close to them. If you can't do that, put a fondant right on top of the cluster. Try to get some ventilation on top. You know, quilt boards are a thing. If you like quilt boards, use them. If you don't, they're not necessary usually. But just you do what you want to do. They work, but they're usually not necessary. And they're not new. It's not something recent. They've been, a couple hundred years they've been used in Northern Europe where it gets really cold. And this is what I like to see. That's what I hope y'all see this fall. Because if you get a healthy bees that size, they're gonna do well and they're gonna be successful. And so when it looks like that outside, put a light on the fire and plan about how you're gonna make a bunch of honey next year. Or money. Right? Everybody knows you make a lot of money keeping bees.
That's right.
Yeah.
Buy equipment.
Yeah.
Yes.
I got a question, and it's probably a good thing to take a scenario for winter time on your entrance reducer.
Mm-hmm.
I've been told up is the way you want it when you put it into your beehive at the bottom. And my argument for that was, how are they gonna carry out the dead bees if they had to? And they said, well, the dead bees can muster up against and give more insulation, and I didn't like that. So I'm just asking you,
Well,
is it up or
I don't-
down?
You know, I put mine down, how's that?
Okay.
If I put them, yeah. That's a perfect example of beekeeping, because if you ask 100 beekeepers how to do a simple task, and you'll get 99 different ideas. So just do what works for you. But down is a good idea in my opinion.
Okay.
Any other questions about wintering or something controversial I said?
Yeah, I got a question.
Yes.
Do you think it's best to run two brood boxes of them? Don't matter.
It does, it's whatever you want to do. It's not, you can winter bees if you know what you're doing in a single deep. You can, many colonies have wintered in North Carolina from the coast to the mountains in a deep and a shallow. I would say that's almost the standard
No.
size. Right.
But I just thinking, you know, wait, you said they're gonna move up, so if you got, two deeps, you're gonna have two, you're gonna go into the winter with two deeps brood in both of them. So how would you handle that?
Well, usually the bees handle that, but if you have to, usually the bees gonna take care of that. Cause in fall, when they start putting in fall honey, which we almost always get some fall honey, they're gonna push the brood down usually, not always. But, you can always, in the late fall, arrange it like they put the brood down and put the honey on top, if the bees didn't already do that.
Yep, I'm done.
And you can use double deep. Some people use double deep just because it's convenient. If you're trying to make splits in the spring, you already got the same size frames and it's easy to make splits.
But if you had one of those infrared cameras and you had two deeps and you took a shot of the bottom deep and it was cold, or you see the shadow of the bees in the second one, can you pull that bottom one out and not disturb them too badly?
If it's cold weather, I would leave them alone. You know, later in the spring, you know, when it's getting warm and the bees are all in the top box because they ate their way up to the top, then I would reverse them and put them back down so they can expand upward, because they expand upward.
Right.
And, you wanna do that in the spring.
Okay.
But I would leave them alone in the cold weather, in the dead cold.
That's just a thought.
Yeah. I mean, like I say, anytime you get honey away from the cluster, I would put honey near the cluster, whatever that means in your column, because they got to be able to reach the honey.
Yep.
And the smaller the cluster, the more important it is to get it close by.
It's gonna make a difference too with whether you use the stream bottoms or solid bottoms.
Yeah, the success of wintering is not controlled by the screen, but, it's pretty much been proven that, clusters move away from the screen in the wintertime, and, solid bottom boards, they're closer to
Stay
the
more
bottom.
down, yeah.
But they adjust that. The value of, screens, has shown to be not as much as people thought, 10, 15 years ago. But if you like them, use them.
I use solid bottom.
That's fine. Once upon a time, the powers that be thought it would be advantageous to have screens so that roll will follow through and they can't come back. And that's been pretty much proven not to be so helpful.
So if I got more than 2 boxes on the hive, are you advocating that I reduce down to 2?
Not necessarily. I mean, if you want to extract the honey, then just pull off what they don't need. You know, if you got 60 pounds in that second box and another 25 or 30 in the high body, then take the rest off and put it in a bucket. But if you don't want to do that, then just leave it on there for storage. I mean, it's not gonna hurt anything unless you got a bad hive beetle problem. I mean, the key to controlling hive beetles, especially in warm weather, is to make sure that you have enough bees to patrol the comb that you have on the box. As long as the bees can patrol the comb, they can control the beetles. But when the cluster gets small or the colony gets small, you got extra empty, it could be empty frames, but if you got extra, then the beetles can get up here and start reproducing, and the bees don't get around to eating the eggs. And that's the key there, is having enough workers where they parasitize or destroy the eggs so they don't become larvae. You can have 10,000 adult beetles, and they're gonna do minimal damage, but when they start getting larvae to hatch out, now that's where you're gonna mess up the colony. They're gonna start sliming it and kill it. I've seen big colonies in a bad part of Carolina where they have a lot of beetles, and that you take the top cover off, and, you know, 5,000 beetles will just fly up when you smoke them into your face. But there was no larvae because it was a strong colony, and basically they had pushed them all up in the inner cover. But there was a ton of them, but they were not making any larvae. And so, trust me, if that colony went queenless, I got weak, boom, in about a week's time, they'd be slimed up, because it only takes about a week, really, 10 days, and they can go from being fine to slimy, when they got a lot of beetles. So that's the key, is to keep an eye on them and keep, and if you have a weak colony, just take the extra combs away, so that they can always, basically, you want them to cover the frames when they get weak, and then you can just add them one at a time as the colony grows, and you won't have that problem. All right, well, I hope I did more explaining than confusing, but if there's anything I can do for you, contact me, or call me. I got a card here somewhere if you need a card, and, you know, we do regulatory, we also do, promotion, and that involves helping beekeepers solve their management problems. And hopefully, if you're a beginner, you got a mentor, but if you need somebody beside your mentor, give me a call. I'll come out and take a look at what you got. Thank you.
Thank you very much.